Hello, welcome, and thank you for watching this webinar hosted by The Forge. I am Yvonne, and I am the co-director of operations at The Forge. Today's discussion focuses on the 70 billion rand loan from the International Monetary Fund to South Africa in emergency support to address the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm joined by Busi Sibego and Duma Kubule. Hello, Busi and Duma, and welcome. Thank you so much for your time.
Hi, thank you for having us.
So Busi Sibeko is the Researcher on Budget Justice Program, and Duma Kubule is the founder of the Center for Economic Development and Transformation. So Duma, as a way to start the conversation, I thought to pose the question you posed in a recent New Frame article, writing about the IMF loan to South Africa. In that particular article, and I'm going to pose this question to you as well, Busi. In that particular article, you title it in the form of a question. And the question that you ask, which I found very intriguing, is whether or not the IMF loan is about politics or economics. So as a way to start the conversation, I wanted to pose that question again to the both of you and ask, is the loan from the IMF to South Africa about economics or about politics? And I'll start with you, Duma, and then you can respond after Duma.
Yvonne, I think a lot of economists, progressive economists like myself and Busi, we were scratching our heads trying to understand why the government would go to the IMF. The first thing that stands out so obviously is that the UIF has got a surplus of 100 billion rands. What you must remember that at the beginning of the year, the UIF had a surplus of 150 billion rands, and then they decided to spend, so the discussion went to net. So for many years, many economists have pointed out that there is no reason to have the surplus. So in NEDLAC at the end of last year, stakeholders were there, Treasury was there, a lot of people were there, and the Treasury couldn't give a reason why we should have the surplus. So Labour, business and government decided to use the surplus to provide benefits to unemployed people, additional benefits to unemployed people. And then COVID came and it was incorporated as part of the COVID response to the government. But from what I heard from the people, that discussion started before COVID about using the surplus productively. And the government couldn't come up with any reason why the surplus has to exist. So now we're sitting with a surplus of 100 billion rands. Even after they've extended it for 6 weeks, there will still be something like 100 billion rands. And so for me, I looked at all the reasons. We have 900 billion rands of foreign exchange reserves. So what I've been arguing for many times in South Africa is that we shouldn't just look at the budget deficit or the debt to GDP ratio. We should look at the whole country's balance sheet, what I call the SA Inc. balance sheet. And when you look at the whole balance sheet, you see that we've got quite a lot of assets. The IMF as well, they did an analysis, they look at the whole balance sheet of a country, and they did a report 2 years ago with and they said that we are number 6 in the world in terms of the wealth that we have as a country. So we've got the assets in the Public Investment Corporation, the Government Employees Pension Fund, we've got the UIF, that's about 2 trillion rand, we've got 900 billion rand in foreign exchange reserves. The government itself has got cash of 260 billion rands. And an economist called Mike Sachs said we could run down that cash balance of 260 billion rands and not go to the bond market and borrow for 8 months. So we've got so many other alternative sources of financing the 70 billion rand. And the 70 billion rand, let's remember, it's only 10% of the budget deficit for this year alone. So this year we have to borrow more than 700 billion rands to finance the budget deficit, and this will not cover even 10% of that. So what I was trying to say, to show to people, is that there's this view that we're having with some economists that, no, let's go to the IMF when we've exhausted domestic resources. But what I was saying is that you can't, a country that is sovereign, that prints its own currency, that issues its own debt, and 90% of our debt is in domestic currency, we can't, that's what I was trying to say, yeah. That's a short version. So then I looked and I talked to some economists. I'm not even sure that this is the correct answer, but they were saying that it's about politics. You know, recently the ANC had to go to the Alliance Secretariat, and it was a difficult debate about the Alliance Secretariat. Many people in the ANC don't like the loan. I get calls from cabinet ministers asking me about this thing. Some of them are opposed to it, you know. And in the Alliance Secretariat, many people wanted the loan under strict conditions. So I think the government doesn't want to go through the messy route of going through negotiating this loan through democratic forums. And what they want is a situation where, if, let's say, COSATU to the SACP, they've got this IMF loan, COSATU to the SACP say, no, we can't do X, we have to cut government and public sector wages, and they'll say we have no option because the IMF loan, this is what we've agreed to. So I can honestly, it's a conspiracy theory, and there's not the only one explanation, because we have the resources to finance this thing on our own, yeah, sorry, yeah.
Sure. Thanks for that, Duma. Usi?
Yeah, I think just to really sum it up, and I'll be quick here, it's just this concept of the maximum available domestic resources argument has not been sufficiently engaged with. I think the National Treasury there's been no participation and transparency from National Treasury to basically say, this is why we are going to the IMF for this loan, right? So again, like Duma's already said, there are many domestic resources that could have looked at. And in fact, I would have, respected them more if they said to us, we've looked at all the options. This is why we can't go this route. This is why we need a loan, and justified it in that way. And I think what is playing out, which is why it seems like a real political tool, is this idea that, the Treasury are the holders of the economy in particular ways. And so it's that issue of National Treasury is the one that's approached the IMF for the loan. But actually, when we see the rhetoric, it's going to be South Africa owes the IMF, right? Even though a subset of people have made this decision. And so I agree with, I think, very importantly, the structural reform and the policy conditions that Treasury put forward were going to happen regardless of the IMF, whether the IMF loan was happening or whether or not it was going to happen regardless. And so it's very important to understand in the political economy of South Africa, what kind of economic policy is being driven and how loans such as this reinforce that already existing paradigm. It's not introducing a new economic policy, but it's reinforcing the existing policy outlook.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that, Abusi. Duma, again, I'm going to refer to the same article because I found a lot of very intriguing concepts that you use in that particular article. And let's now talk about the IMF. So you refer to the IMF as the machinist of international finance. And that immediately intrigues me because I myself am from Bedford, one of the most poorest places in South Africa, in the Eastern Cape, surrounded by farmers and farm workers. And a lot of them are caught in this perpetual cycle of umashonisa. And I found that this relationship is very abusive. So there's a perpetual cycle of loaning money that is very abusive in many ways. And it takes away the sovereignty of these very poor people on their finances. So if I think of umashonisa, I'm thinking the terms around when you get the money, how much you get, also the conditions around how you repay the loan are dependent on umashonisa. And also, the thing that I also find very abusive is the fact that umashonisa keeps your bank card and keeps your identity document. So you can't go and then decide, I'm going to just take my ID and go get a new bank card. So the relationship itself, I don't even want to call it a relationship. The transaction itself is very violent, and the conditions around it are very violent. And it's a perpetual cycle because these people are poor, and it's very difficult to get out of that perpetual cycle. So when you say the IMF is a machinist of international finance, that immediately intrigues me. And I think of these conditions around borrowing money and making loans available by local machinistas. And I think of how violent that relationship is and how violent and how abusive that relationship is. And I think of how one's sovereignty around their money and getting access to their money is ridiculously reduced. Or they actually don't have any sovereignty over their money. The machinista has most or all control over their money. So when you then refer to the International Monetary Fund as a machinista of international finance, I'm then intrigued about, if you look at that concept of machinista at the local level, how then to apply it to the International Monetary Fund, and particularly developing countries that find themselves in this perpetual cycle with the IMF. How do you unpack that for us so that we understand its abusive nature, but also its implications and its long-term effects, and that perpetuality that you see at the local level? How do we unpack that then at the international level?
Thank you very much. One of the most scary things I ever witnessed, I went to Braamfontein at about one day, about 10 years ago, just after midnight, to withdraw some cash at the ATM. I was driving somewhere else. And then two guys were in front of me, and they had so many bank cards, and they were withdrawing money from this bank card after midnight, when people are getting paid. And I found it the scariest thing. They said, no, you go first, I'll withdraw later. I was like, and that's what they do for a living. So this analogy of the machinista, I was discussing it with my sister, the story, and she came with that analogy for me, which I give her credit for. But the point is, this loan was being sold to us that, no, it's 1%. Number two, it's just 70 billion rand. It's got less conditions, But first of all, on the 1%, there's no, so on the conditions, there's no loan that doesn't have conditions. As Busi is saying, it just happens that what we are doing was music to it was what the IMF already wanted us to do, And then the second issue is that on the 1%, it doesn't talk about the exchange rate risk that we face as a country when we borrow in in a foreign currency. What happens is that in finance, it's called the original sin. In South Africa, we've got the unique privilege amongst developing countries of having 90% of our debt denominated in our own currency. And there's an economist who used to be on the Treasury. He's a Venezuelan economist called Ricardo Hausmann. He did a study some years ago. I don't know if the figures are still valid, which showed that we are the only country that they had looked at, developing country, that had that kind of a privilege. Because so we should maintain our national sovereignty by not depending on foreign currency. And the reason for that, Yvonne, is that so let me start with the Medupi loan. The Medupi loan to Eskom was done at an exchange rate of 7. The exchange rate against the dollar now is 17. So that gives you an idea of how much more you need to pay on the Medupi loan. But it seemed harmless at the time, but now, many years later, 11 years later, or whenever that loan was taken, we're now at 17 rands against the dollar. We have to pay more than double what we were supposed to pay in the beginning. So the thing about the machonista is that every single loan for the machonista, they give you a hook. Yeah. And the first loan is supposed to be easy, but then you end up in a cycle of perpetual dependency. There's this UCT economist, he says 11 countries who went to IMF loans went on to depend on it for 30 years. 32 countries went on to depend on it for 20 and 29 years. And 41 countries went on to depend on it for between 10 and 19 years. So that is the kind of cycle of debt that you end up with. So the people in your house, in your community in Bedford, I'm also from, half my family is also from a similar area, is that it seemed you just needed to pay school fees. And then you went there, and it seems harmless enough, you know, like I need to top up the school fees or whatever. And then you end up going back to the same machonista for year after year. And that's what happens in international finance once countries get hooked into this. And then the last thing I have to say is that in emerging market crises over the past 4 decades. So the first one was in Mexico in 1982. Mexico spread to the whole of Latin America, and then spread to the whole of Africa. There were more than 40 countries in the developing world that were caught up in what is called the 1980 sovereign debt crisis. Now, what happened there is that they had borrowed in dollars in Mexico, and then a new governor came in at the central bank in the US Fed, and he hiked interest rates to record levels. So the loan was initially at low interest rates, like I can't remember what the number was, and then later it was close to 20% that they had to pay on the same loans in addition to the foreign currency risk. So when you borrow in foreign currency, there's this thing called a currency mismatch, whereby you're paying in a foreign currency, and it can cause havoc with your finances as a country. And finally, in South Africa, we've got the most volatile exchange rate. It's every day. So that type of thing can play havoc with the planning, the budgeting of countries throughout the world. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Duma. Lucy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the machonista analogy is great. And the reason why it's great is because I think we can't engage with the IMF topic or the World Bank or any international financial institution without dealing with the history and very heavy history of these institutions and how they've perpetuated certain economic policies globally, particularly on the African continent. As Duma said, from the 1980s, a lot of countries were experiencing policy externalization, meaning that their policies within their countries were being driven by IMF loans and so forth. And so even the IMF themselves have said that the issue with the programs that they were implementing is that there was no structural transformation. So even after decades of these programs, these countries themselves were not developing in ways that would make them sustainable. In fact, they were just becoming, debt reliant, right? Like they were reliant on the IMF. In the end, you are borrowing to pay debt. So you are in the cycle. It's like you go to your machonista, you borrow once, then you can't pay your machonista, and you go and you borrow again to pay that first loan. Now you've got a second loan, and then you have to continuously feed this debt. And that's why you've got heavily indebted countries on the African continent. And there's this discussion about debt relief and so forth, which is really the only way out for a lot of countries. In fact, there must be relief, completely, not you have to pay 10 years from now. It must be completely written off. And in South Africa, of course, there's also issues around odious debt, which is debt that is, how can I explain it in a simple way? But debt that is given under bad conditions, kind of like if you think back about the African Bank and VPS giving loans to people who were in a way unqualified to be having those loans, right? And so then you create this bad cycle of bad debt and continuously so. So I think with the IMF in particular, I think there's no way that we can discuss. It's like thinking that your machonista is a reformed person. It's assuming that your machonista was bad and beat up other people, and now you're gonna borrow from the machonista, and they're now this nice person who is just going to be nice to you. And I think just part of that history to also indicate that, the IMF, after all these issues, right, poverty became a key elements that the IMF started tackling and the World Bank in the late 90s, because they realized that their policies were actually increasing inequality. So they started tackling inequality as a key issue. And that after the financial crisis, when people started questioning what's the role of the IMF and the World Bank in the world, what are they here for really? And then what happened is after the financial crisis, then they, came back and realized, crisis is when they really thrive, as we can see in South Africa, right? Because if there wasn't a crisis, we wouldn't be with the IMF right now. So then what they did is that they introduced these two new instruments, which were supposed to be non-condition instruments, which is one of the ones that we have, the rapid financing instrument. So they said, look, conditionalities have not yielded what we wanted in many countries. In fact, we've overburdened people with conditionalities. There's this great study by, I think it's Kinetis, his last name, and they show that over a period of time, there were like 50,000 conditions that the IMF had implemented on various countries over time. They created this database as part of a PhD paper that showed like the IMF conditionalities and how they weren't actually declining, even though the IMF was saying we've changed our ways, we are now better people and so forth. And so that's why these two instruments emerged, because of these problematic conditionalities for over decades. And now we say there are no conditionalities, right? Legally binding conditionalities. That's the way it would be interpreted. But at the end of the day, South Africa is committing to certain reforms. And well, whether they deliver or not, well, we don't know what the ramifications are, because with international financial institutions, you don't really know what the direct implications are. But at the same time, it is a commitment, and it is a global commitment. It is a market commitment, which is what South Africa's government does all the time with the budget. You can see clearly that the budget was actually there to motivate for the IMF loan. Like, it's very clear, because when you read this IMF document, it's literally the supplementary budget plus like two new things. But you can see already that the decision to approach in a particular way, the policy was already created at the supplementary budget, and we're seeing it now.
Yeah, I actually wanted us to talk about that. So I know that both you and Duma mentioned this idea of the fact that, domestic reserves have not necessarily been exhausted, but also the fact that the process has been it hasn't been transparent, but now we have the loan. Surely there must have been commitments and motivations made, and I'm interested to know and further to that, what are the long-term implications of those commitments and motivations? Duma, you can start us off with that one.
Okay, sure. The one that, to look for another analogy, my father was a bishop in the Methodist Church. And who was it in the Bible who offered his son as a sacrifice? And to show God how much he believed in God. I can't remember who it was. But anyway, the issue is we offered something called a debt ceiling to show the IMF how much we are committed to doing the things that you say we must do. Now, they didn't ask for a debt ceiling. We offered it to them. Now, let me explain what a debt ceiling is. In the US, they've had this debt ceiling since 1917. Now, what it means is if your debt reaches, let's say, 100% of GDP, for example, then you're not allowed to issue any more debt. You have to balance your books with your tax versus your spending. So you can't issue new debts. Now, in the US, this has become a political football. It's something that both parties don't take seriously. So when they get into trouble, I don't know if you remember the US, they have this thing called the showdown. What's it called? They shut down, a shutdown of government when the Republicans, when the one party wants to activate the debt ceiling, and you had the US government shut down a few times because around the debate around this debt ceiling. And then Trump currently, he has suspended the debt ceiling until July 2021. So the point is, every party that has been in power in the US has found ways to avoid this debt ceiling and to make it irrelevant. So it's just a political football that parties use against each other. When the Republicans are in power, they ignore it. And when the Democrats are in power, they call for the debt ceiling, if you understand what I'm saying. Yeah. So it's a dangerous thing, and I'm sure Busi will explain it even better than me, why it is so dangerous. It's such a dangerous commitment that we're making as a country, because there's no level of debt that you can say it's a tipping point at which the country will collapse. After the global financial crisis, one guy wrote that if your debt goes above 90% of GDP, your country collapses. And then another group of economists showed that they had made like some Excel coding errors in their research, which had been quoted by many governments throughout the world. So there is no tipping point. And I just have to address this issue of debt. So before we started off, in March 2020, our debt to GDP ratio, I wish I had the numbers in front of me, it was about 60% of GDP. And so now what is going to happen is that was not high by international standards. It wasn't high by developing country, upper middle income countries. And Egypt was at, I think, 90%. Argentina was at 90%. And Mozambique, our neighbors, at 101%. Angola is at 90%, and so forth. And Brazil, Pakistan. So many upper income and lower income countries we were in the same boat as many countries. But what's going to happen to every country in the world? You're going to have exactly the same shock to your economy, to your GDP. Your economy will collapse by 10% if you haven't done anything because of the lockdown. So what the IMF has done, they show that every single country, the average debt to GDP ratio in the world will increase by 19 percentage points. So in South Africa, guess what? We are going to increase by exactly 19 percentage points to 80%. So we are going to be exactly where we were in March before the lockdown in relative terms. So when the machinistas, the other machinistas want to lend money to countries, they're going to find that everybody is in the same debt situation. And are you now going to say, this one is at 80%, this one's at 90%, I'm only going to lend? It's not going to work like that. So what I'm trying to say is that the issue of debt, we do not have a debt problem in South Africa. I have to address this. We have a growth problem. So if you have an income of X, let's say 100,000, and your debt is 10,000, it's not a lot of money because your income. So if you start growing the bottom part of the debt to GDP ratio, that is what causes your debt to go down. And you also have to reduce the cost of capital. We are paying too much in terms of interest on our debt. So that's what I'm trying to say. So we must focus on growing the economy, because with economic growth and not austerity, that is what keeps your debt affordable. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks so much, Juma. That's very rich. Busi?
Yeah, so I think maybe to start with sort of the general commitments of the government, but also just to just respond as well, to add to what Duma is saying, to say that I think people mistake progressive economists for saying that we shouldn't care about debt at all, right? Like, and it's not, no one is saying we should have increasing debt forever. No one ever argues for that, right? Like, and I think there's misappropriation of our arguments continuously, including the argument to spend. People assume that we just want spend for spending's sake. We want debt to increase for debt increasing sake, but that's not really what we are advocating for. And so one of the commitments is obviously fiscal consolidation, which means basically cutting budgets, which we've already seen in the supplementary budget that they plan to cut by 230 billion over the next 2 years, which is problematic generally because, one, South Africa hasn't really approached budget cutting in a way that is that progresses human rights, right? So you can see that there's been a reduction in per capita spend in education for a number of years. I think now it's a decade long, and Nick Spall does a lot of research around this. And you can see that there's been per capita declines in healthcare spend. And guess what? We are now in a healthcare crisis, and we've been gradually cutting healthcare spend over the years. And now guess what? We need it, right? And so I think, the approaches to how we've been cutting spend is actually not conducive or progressive or nuanced or thought of in a way that is actually strategic and in a way that progresses what we are trying to achieve as a country. In fact, most of the budget cuts have been constitutionally blind. And I think we see this over and over again. South Africa's the constitution is the supreme law of the country, but our economic policy is not reflective of that. And you can see with the supplementary budget that is not the main focus. It's about balancing the books. That's it's not about the people. It's not about the implications in that particular way. So I think that's the first one, fiscal consolidation, the introduction of zero-based budgeting, which is really just a tool to cut expenditure because then projects will have to be justified from scratch. And I mean, I ask why Treasury hasn't been justifying projects to begin with. So I think there's a big conversation we're going to need to have about accountability. And, even when we talk about the wage bill, there's this tendency to say, Treasury must cut the wage bill and whatnot. But nobody says, but Treasury, why did you guys let this get out of hand to begin with? If you think it's out of hand, that is. Why all these years didn't you ensure that it's, it's appropriate or whatever it is? And so I do think that there's a huge conversation that we need to have about accountability from Treasury's end about the economic policies they've implemented over time that have caused this crisis that we are in, because we're about to go into depression because of the economic policy they're still making and the way that they make these economic policies, which is a very top-down approach. So of course, there's also other commitments to inflation targeting, which is, we've always done that, so nothing new around that. Considering the debt ceiling, which Duma's already spoken about, but also the debt ceiling issue is also an issue of how can you have a debt ceiling and also ensure that you meet your constitutional obligations? So at what point do we decide this is how many human rights we can provision? Above this means more debt. Therefore, sorry, no human rights for you guys. Like, you don't get housing because we have too much debt now. Like, and that's, I don't think we can do that as a country that has this particular constitution. But I mean, there's people who are tweeting at me saying, or someone, and I'm going to read this particular tweet, who was basically saying, how dare the IMF kind of ask us to stop our government from stealing, privatize black, whole state-owned enterprises and cut our absolutely bloated and overpaid civil service. And I mean, I'll start with the civil service one, which is to say, first of all, I think it's again, I always say this, it's not about the size of the wage bill itself, it's the equity within the wage bill, but also acknowledging that there are many vacancies that need to be filled. So people who are pro cutting the wage bill actually don't think about these vacancies. They just think if we cut salaries, this is resolved. But no, like there are 38,000 vacant posts in the healthcare sector and we are in a healthcare crisis. Imagine if we had filled these vacancies earlier on. I think the issue of corruption, whether the money is from IMF, whether the money is from wherever, whether it's from tax, corruption will always be an issue. It doesn't mean like just because the IMF sweeps in that all of a sudden we're going to change overnight. That's not going to happen, right? Like the reality is that corruption will remain an issue. And in fact, people think of corruption as Lucy took 10 Rand and put it in her pocket. I'm always saying to people that I'm more concerned about high performing corruption, the corruption that delivers and takes its cut. Because that corruption we don't catch, and that's the big corruption in our budgets, right? Because if there's inflated prices, for instance, for infrastructure spend, large infrastructure spend, you know what I mean? Like if there's a building, like, yay, government delivered, but then we don't think, well, what about all that other money that we could have used for something else? So state-owned enterprises, of course, we're going to see privatization. And that's a whole nother debate, which... I don't think we can even begin to unpack in this particular conversation.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lucy. And I like that you brought the issues around corruption as well, because I was going to ask. So now we know that the 70 billion Rand will be granted to South Africa. And immediately, I think this is why there was such an uproar when people heard that, well, South Africa has been granted 70 billion Rand by the IMF. And it's meant to be an emergency support to address the COVID-19 pandemic. And many people are asking, recently reports of looting, reports of corruption, financial mismanagement, all these horrible things. Unfortunately, our government doesn't have a good record when it comes to all of these issues. So then you hear that the 70 billion rand has been granted to South Africa. You then ask yourself, will it reach its intended beneficiaries? And I mean, I know there's no easy way to answer this, but really it's centered around how worried people are, and the broken trust between many South African citizens and the government. And it's warranted because of its record of corruption, including money laundering, people in the president's office, and their husbands. So really the question, I mean, I'm interested to know if what your thinking is around the issue of whether or not we think this is really going to be used for what it was granted for.
Can I start?
Sure.
Well, when you go to the Mashonisa, you already know what you're going to spend the money on. I needed to extend that back room. Or I needed to pay the school fees. So let me just explain that this money from the IMF is not going to result in us fixing any hospitals in the Eastern Cape. It's not going to be spent on anything new because it has already been covered in the supplementary budget. And Lucy is the country's best expert on the budget. She can explain it better. But the point is, the government has already said we are going to increase non-interest expenditure by 36 billion rands this year. Number one. Number two, the following 2 years, we're going to cut spending by 230 billion rands. And we're going to increase taxes by 25 billion rands. So that is the commitment, what we told the IMF, what we're going to do. We had already committed that before we got this loan. Even if we got this loan, this is what we would have done according to the Treasury. Now, let me explain the issue of corruption so that people understand. So what we are saying is that there was no 500 billion rand stimulus package, but that doesn't mean people were not stealing. So let me explain what I mean. So what it means is that stimulus is the injection of new money into the economy. So what happened in this supplementary budget, I don't have the figures in front of me, the government took from Thandi to give to Talk. So what they said is that we're going to take money from infrastructure in schools, in universities, and everything else, and we're going to take the money, the same money, and we're going to spend it on Thandi, and that is COVID expenditure. Now, with the COVID expenditure, it is emergency procurement. Now, the minute South Africans saw emergency procurement, they should have known that that is a flashing red light. And it was a movie, you know how this movie is going to end when you see emergency procurement. So what I'm trying to say is that we must separate the issues. There is no stimulus because you took from one source. So you're taking money from infrastructure, from hospital infrastructure, provincial infrastructure, and you're giving it to COVID. It makes no sense to me. Yeah. So that is what I'm talking about. So that's what we should talk. And now on the issue of corruption, I think we are in the deepest crisis in a century. We have to have institutional innovations in terms of we need to have like a public-private ring-fence institution, a temporary institution that is going to spend this money. Now, what I can't understand, my last question, is that I was speaking to a friend of mine who's a businessman in the Eastern Cape, who's very conservative, And I said, but now, you probably know him, but I was saying, but now, do you want your business to collapse because you're so opposed to corruption? So what would happen when, if we had the Solidarity Fund spend this money, the stimulus money in the Eastern Cape? Why would you have a problem with that? Do you see what I'm saying? So the point is, what I can't understand is the business. We have to find an institutional arrangement that bypasses government temporarily. And I understand that during the New Deal under Roosevelt in the US, they set up many of these agencies that were temporary because we have to get money to the people quickly. And finally, I have to do this, and thing I do, I talk about the basic income grant. We need to have a basic income grant at the upper bound poverty level of about 1,200 rands. And I think that thing can be corruption proof if we don't put too many conditions on it. And you just have to provide your ID and you get it. In South Korea, part of the stimulus package, they gave 14,000 rand to everybody to spend, and there was a time limit. You had to spend it to get the economy going. They wanted the economy to grow by the next quarter. So people, I was reading in the Financial Times, one lady, she went and did some cosmetic job on her face. Somebody wanted this expensive bicycle that she had always wanted, and she went and bought this expensive high-performance bicycle. But that's what we want. We want people to spend the money because we're in a crisis situation. There's been a collapse of aggregate demand. And I do think South Africans, we must find ways of temporarily bypassing this, what Yvonne calls a broken state, and finding institutional innovations that will allow us to get the money to the people who need it as soon as possible.
Yeah. I think in relation to the corruption, I think just to summarize again, it's like 500 billion is not gone. I wish I could tell that to every single South African. Like 500 billion has not been spent and is gone. That's not what is happening. I know corruption is obviously like massively an issue, but that's not really what's happening in South Africa. And I think misinformation is really disruptive in this current state of crisis. And just to say that, obviously, like Duma said, the 70 billion is not in addition to the 500 billion. We don't have 570 billion now, right? That's not what's happening. The 70 billion was there to basically plug the shortfall, right? Because we know that it's a crisis and our tax is going to go down, and already said, like the Treasury is going to spend 709 billion more than what they'd anticipated. So there's a shortfall in our tax, and therefore the borrowing is therefore to plug that and to be spent on budget items for the most part, right? So those are the two very important elements that need to be understood, I think, in the general public, so that we can put the corruption into focus, right? Like in a particular manner. And to say that I think corruption can be resolved. And so I'm seeing literature from the United States and other developing countries that where corruption is becoming a crisis globally. First of all, let's start there. South Africa is not unique. We're not an anomaly. In crisis, people react in irrational ways or rational ways that optimize their own utilities, you could argue. But either way, crisis induces certain behavior. And if you understand behavioral economics, you understand that people are really just selfish and out for themselves. And that's the rational economics human beings. So that's expected, right? And so there's great emerging literature from these developed countries and developing countries about how they're tackling corruption with their stimulus packages, because it's a strife problem everywhere. And so in America, what you're hearing is fiscal stimulus with an anti-corruption strategy. And I think that's where we need to be in South Africa, right? We need to say, we want a supplement. In fact, this is how the supplementary budget should have been designed. This is the additional spend, and this is the anti-corruption strategy that encloses this whole package. So this is how we're going to spend: one, to build capacity; two, to ensure that this money gets to these people. So including things like SASSA. How are we going to get these people money? Like Duma saying, how do we streamline this process to stop corruption in the middle, right? Like, so we need a particular state of mind that is anti-corruption spending strategy. Because ultimately, if you want to spend more in a system that's already broken, right? Corruption is not a COVID crisis new element. It's always been there, right? These elements already existed and we knew they existed. So the way that we should have gone about it was to actually design, like Duma saying, innovative ways to make sure, bypass all of those and ensure that the money goes where it's supposed to go. So that's the one thing. I do think as well that we don't have a nuanced understanding of corruption in South Africa in particular ways. I think there's this very like cut-paste understanding of corruption. Boosie gets 10 rand, Boosie puts in her pockets. That's corruption. You know, like I said, like we don't think about high-performing corrupt programs. We don't think about all these other things. And I think there's a very interesting study by Mushta Khan, who was the convener of my master's course. And he's been studying corruption strategies in Nigeria, Bangladesh, and other developing countries. And I think we really need to get to that point. I think we need to move beyond this corruption to like there's corruption, and these are the ways in which we're going to fix this corruption in various ways. And I think I get discouraged when I see people who are great thinkers in our economy just highlighting that there's corruption. I think we all need to do that thinking work to say, okay, Busi, I work with the budget. How could the budget be restructured in a way that would not cause corruption in that way, right? Like when we talk about basic income grants, how would it have to be designed through SASSA or without SASSA, whatever way, however way we want to restructure it such that it yields the outcomes that we want. I think institutionally, this can be a very great moment. I used to say to my friends during lockdown level 5, yo, guys, the government had a lot of time to change its ways. Hey, they had time to restructure, remodel, build new websites, whatever they wanted to do, they could have done it. Like that was a very golden moment. Like, and I feel like we lost it, right? Like that was a very, very golden moment to really restructure and not restructure in an economic sense because that means something else, but restructure institutionally to ensure that these things are ready. Like there's no reason why it took SASSA so long to distribute the COVID relief when there was so much time. In fact, in other countries, they did it in a way faster than we could have done it. And this is not to say that, we must compare ourselves. I know that South Africa is unique and so forth, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's like, how many people are hired within SASSA? You know what I mean? Like how many people are capable of doing this within SASSA? And we need and this is not, it's just to say, how are we using our resources adequately in ways that enhance our state as opposed to hold it back or underutilize? And I'd argue that maybe the issue isn't that people aren't working. Maybe the issue is that people are being underutilized within the departments. And so if Busi is, let's say Busi was a brilliant programmer and I work for government and government is not challenging me to do those programs and I'm just there, like I'm doing like computer, someone's computer's off, someone's calling me to come and do like basic, you know what I mean? And I do think that's another thing we're going to have to tackle, underemployment within government. I see the wage bill, I see whatever, but underemployment within government where we are not utilizing people's skills to the best of their abilities will need to be tackled in a way as well to build state capacity and also to tackle corruption in the same time.
Okay. Yeah, thanks so much for that, Lucy. And maybe as a way to end the conversation, I know Juma alluded to this somewhere in the middle of the conversation, but we'll see, you brought it up again. So maybe as a way to end the conversation, we can talk about this institutional restructuring that you talk about. So, I mean, what would it look like? How would it work? How would it happen? So, what are some of the things that needs to happen to ensure that this institutional restructuring happens? Maybe I'll start with you, Duma, and Lucy can end us off.
At the beginning, when I was thinking about this, I was remembering the World Cup. But everybody reminded me that, the World Cup was not a good example because we just passed the corruption to FIFA, but we got the stadiums built. So maybe it's what Lucy calls high performance corruption. But let's think about the stimulus packages globally. I looked at the Malaysian one, 50% went to households. So what you should remember is that there is no need, if SASSA is not going to work, we must find another institutional arrangement to get this money to the people as soon as possible. As Busi was saying, we had all this period during the lockdown. If we could have come up, I know that the banks were working on other proposals, how they could get the money to the people quicker. I was reading every day what is happening in different countries, in Malaysia, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, where they're distributing this money very quickly because they started their stimulus packages way before us. There was a lot of time to learn as to what is happening in the rest of the world in terms of the models of distributing this money. That's number one. Number two, South Africans must understand that not all stimulus package money goes through the government. For example, there are also loan guarantee schemes don't go through government. The central bank can introduce new funding windows like you have in the US. So the US Fed has introduced 11 new funding windows, which go directly to states, which go to different parts of society. So those don't have to be spent by the government. It can be spent by businesses, it can be spent by other people. Do you see what I'm saying? We could give, in China, one of the first things they did after the thing is that the central bank introduced a facility to lend money to hospitals. We could be giving money to NGOs through the central bank. Do you see what I'm saying? So what we see, we must just forget what we learned about economics in the past. We must just put that all beside us. We must reimagine our country now. We must just forget what has happened in the past. And we must just say, we're starting from scratch now, guys. Let's forget about everything. What do we do to get it right this time?
Sure. Lucy?
Yeah, I think I couldn't re-emphasize that even more, like reimagining the economy, reimagining what it's for, who does it serve, how does it serve those, how does it reproduce structural inequalities. Actually, I think that's the exercise that we haven't done well in South Africa since democracy, right? Is to really dismantle those structural injustices that are continuously perpetrated by the institutions and how they exist and function within our country, right? Like whether, obviously patriarchy, capitalism, and racism, very real structures that we need to dismantle. And I think the crisis, I know people say, the crisis is an opportunity. And a lot of people are saying, we can't have business as usual. But then when you hear what people are really saying after they say that, is really a reproduction of the same systems, just reformed in a way. And I think we have to be careful as a society that we don't have this false illusion that this moment is changing things drastically. I think very importantly. And I think that in terms of designing institutions and understanding political institutions in South Africa is very important, right? The political economy of institutions, because we can't separate those two. And I think sometimes people are, think, economics is a science and politics, like Tito said, some people shouldn't engage in these kind of discussions because we don't understand politics, whatever. But people see these things as distinct, like economics as a science and politics as this other thing. But these things are very much integrated. And I think and people do this research all the time, right? Like, how do we restructure our institutions? How do we rebuild this economy? Should be at the core and not reproducing the status quo. And I think in terms of institutional reform, it's very hard to get there. If there's anything I learned from, my education in economics, is that getting institutional economics, especially if the political settlement of the country doesn't want that institutional change, is very difficult. And so I think our role really is to, one, demonstrate, and we've been doing this. I think maybe the part is we just need those people to hear us. I think that's a very important element, right? To hear and understand us. And I think when this, and that's why I mentioned this issue of people think we're just saying spending for spending's sake, are not listening to us, right? So in this upcoming paper that we'll be publishing that I wrote, it's basically about how do you build state capacity with a fiscal stimulus, right? So state capacity also includes HR. How do you hire the appropriate people? State capacity includes hiring doctors. State capacity includes, like having a person who can do monitoring and evaluation, right? And state capacity, and I want to mention one very important thing here, is state capacity is not cutting Stats SA money, which has emerged as a key issue. Stats SA's budget is going to be cut, and they're not going to be able to do the living conditions survey. How do you rebuild institutions? How do you make economic policy that speaks to the needs of the people when you cut budgets for the data you need to do that work? And so I really think, and I think it's very unfortunate and very disheartening, because the way that Treasury is moving has demonstrated this non-interest actually in hearing this other part of what other people have to say about how we can move this economy in a different way. There's a very much deep obsession with neoliberal economics, to put it mildly, and neoliberal economics in itself and the institutions that are designed around that lead to massive inequalities, as we know, right? So yeah, so I think this is there's a lot to unpack, and I could talk about this all day, but there's really a lot to rethink, to reimagine, to re-research. But what's more important is the willingness of the state to do its work, I think, is really what's key here.
Yvonne, I just want to make one point. What Busi was talking about neoliberalism. So what we've seen in South Africa recently is a vulgar neoliberalism. You know, you can have neoliberalism with a human face, like what you're seeing in the UK. But now what you're seeing here is this vulgar neoliberalism. It is more extreme than Bolsonaro in Brazil. It's more extreme than Trump. It's more extreme than Boris Johnson. And I think all South Africans, we must put an end to this vulgar neoliberalism that we're seeing from our state.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Duma. Thank you, Busi, as well. That brings us to the end of the conversation. Thank you so much for your time. And also thank you so much for such a rich, conversation. It's very refreshing. And also your views, very progressive views on how we can think about, talk about, write about economics. I found it extremely educational. And yeah, so thank you we really appreciate it at the Forge. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.